Good morning. What a privilege it is to call Jesus Christ our friend, as we are able to do today. And what a great thing it is to be gathered together as friends and brothers and sisters in the faith to worship him this morning. Welcome also to those who are with us online. We're glad that you're all here today for this common purpose that we share. It's good to see you all. So this week I was reading something interesting about the American bicentennial celebration in 1976. That, of course, was the 200-year anniversary of something that happened in 1776. History folks will know what that is. That was the signing of the Declaration of Independence. So in 1976 was the bicentennial celebration of that. A pretty impressive milestone, if you ask me. Of course, my alma mater, Harding, which turns 100 next year, is going to reach that milestone even faster because at Harding, every 100 years is a bicentennial. That went about as well as I thought it was going to. But getting back on track, the thing that I was reading earlier this week was actually a speech given on that day, the bicentennial day, by Gerald Ford. He was the president of the United States at the time of that celebration. And this speech that he gave took place in Philadelphia on July the 4th, 1976, 200 years later to the day of July the 4th, 1776. And he stood right there in front of this building in Philadelphia that's called Independence Hall. And that, of course, was the place where those very words were signed. And our country declared its intention to be free. Now, of course, it would be several years later before the country was actually free, as in independent from Britain. But in 1776, they put the ink to paper and then stepped down the steps of that building into a place that was not their own, but they hoped that it would be. And then 200 years later, Gerald Ford stood on the steps of that very same place and marked the occasion with some words. What do you say at a time and a place like that? In the book of Joshua, chapter 24, Israel's leader, Joshua, finds himself in kind of a place to say a few words on a similar occasion. If you've got a Bible and you want to turn there, that's where we're going to be today, Joshua chapter 24. And when you get there, you're arriving at a milestone moment, a milestone time for Israel. In this case, the milestone is kind of like the end of an era for Israel. Joshua has been leading the people of Israel since the days when Moses died. Moses was their leader out of Egypt. And all through the wilderness wanderings, it was Moses who was the leader, really all the way up to the point where they got to the threshold of what was called the Promised Land. They traveled all this way to the Promised Land, and there's a river there called the Jordan River, and that was like the line that they would pass through into the Promised Land, but Moses did not pass through that river. And the people of Israel at that time, they didn't pass through that river either. It was not until the next generation, it was not until Joshua, that they finally crossed over that threshold and made their way into the Promised Land. And it was Joshua who led them in. But that land was not their own. They had only the hope of God's promise to them to stake their claim in. Fast forward now to the end of Joshua, Joshua chapter 24. And in our chapter today, as Joshua nears the end of his life and he's ready to pass on the mantle of leadership, and the book of Joshua reaches its conclusion, now Joshua is standing in a place called Shechem in the Promised Land. But that hope from before has become a reality. Where he is standing now is now their home. It's now their place. And so he says some words. What do you say at a time and a place like that to mark such an occasion? I found myself wondering this. This year, and in fact this very month, is something of a milestone for us as a congregation. College Hill's first month, when it was just getting started, before there was this building, before there was any building, when it was just meeting on the campus of a college that's no longer a college across the street from here. Our first month was the month of April, 1963. So 60 years ago this month would be the beginning of the hope of this congregation for this neighborhood beginning to become a reality. We've already passed now that exact day, which I think was the last Sunday in March, and then it was in April that they began to establish that weekly pattern of meeting on Sunday mornings. And now here today, 60 years later, we continue that still. And that's a pretty cool milestone. What's even more cool than the date on the calendar, of course, are all of the things that happened and made up those years. When you think about the relationships that have formed and blossomed here, the shared church projects, the shared mission, the shared outreach here, the voices blending in worship here, as we've done this morning, people who have marriages that have begun right here up on these steps, friends that we've said goodbye to right up on these steps, the children we've watched running up and jumping off these steps, growing up to be men and women who love God, people becoming children of God, baptized right here in these waters. A lot of amazing things have happened here in the past 60 years. Many life stories have been enriched and shaped by this place. So to reach a milestone like that is pretty special. And as I reflected on that, I thought, what do you say at a time and a place like this? And that's what got me thinking about Joshua. Because when Joshua was standing before the people in that final chapter of Joshua, Joshua told the story of where they had been together. In fact, he told more than that. If you look at the beginning of that chapter, beginning in verse 2, Joshua actually tells the story of this people before they were even called a people. He goes all the way back to the father of Abraham, who was a man named Terah. And Terah, the father of Abraham, worshipped other gods. And then Joshua tells the story of how God called Abraham and began to form and shape a people around this promise that was given to Abraham. And Joshua reminds them of how Abraham and Isaac and Jacob walked through the very land in which they are now standing before it was their own. And he tells the story of how people of Israel went to Egypt and back again, how they wandered in the wilderness, how they faltered in their faith, how they did not get to go in to the promised land. And then he tells them more recent history, their own history. He tells them how this generation was the one to cross through the waters into the promised land. And they met with Jericho, and they met with the other places that comprised the promised land, the Canaanites and the people who were there. And God, working through them, brought the walls of Jericho to the ground. And he handed these places over to them. All these things happened right before their eyes. So Joshua tells them all these things on this day. He tells them all the things of where they've been together. And it would have been a really awesome speech, even if he had stopped right there. Now, who would have blamed him for stopping there? Because in that story of where they had been together, there were so many cherished memories of the victories they had won together, of coming together and uniting for a common purpose, of this mission they had and the way that they sought to carry it out in faith. To mark that occasion looking back would be a really special thing. And yet Joshua did not stop with where they had been together. Even more important to Joshua was the story of where they were going. And so all those memories that he touched upon, the ones that he recounted before them on that day, they were really kind of just an appetizer to what he really wanted to say to them. What Joshua really wanted to say to them, more than anything, was this: now, therefore, revere the Lord and serve him in sincerity and in faithfulness. Put away the gods that your ancestors served beyond the river in those former days and in Egypt, and serve the Lord. And if you are unwilling to serve the Lord, choose this day whom you will serve, whether the gods your ancestors served in the region beyond the river or the gods of the Amorites in whose land you are living. But as for me and my household, we will serve the Lord. In other words, when Joshua had the chance to address the people on this milestone day, he looked back, yes, certainly he did, at where they had been before, because in that story of where they had come from were the roots of their sincere faith. That's where the promises of God were shown to be so secure. They could look back on that story and see the many ways that God said, I am with you, and proved that true. Joshua looked back at all of that. There was so much to cherish in that. But this thing that he says next, this charge, which turns the focus forward, this is the thing I really want us to focus on right now. These verses have so much that they want to tell us. And they're relevant for us right now, too. Because they remind us of this powerful responsibility that we all have to choose this day whom we will serve. Joshua says these words to a people who had accomplished so much more than the generation that came before them. These were the people that did pass through the river and into the promised land. Their ancestors did not do that. This people rallied together for their mission. And over the years, God claimed many great victories in them. God was making good on his promise in these people's lives. They'd accomplished amazing things. And yet Joshua knew that even they must continue to choose in the present what they had chosen in the past. Joshua knew how important it would be for these people to continually choose to be a people for God. And that unless they continue to reassess and recommit themselves to what really mattered most, well, a couple of things might happen. One thing that might happen is they might regress. They might go backwards, you might say. So Joshua mentions the danger of going back to the way of life beyond the river, like the way of life before they've had this life-changing moment of crossing over and seeking to live out the promise of God in their own lives. He's warning them about losing the progress they made in their faithful devotion to God and just going back to the way things were before. Joshua says that's something that might happen unless they continue to reassess and recommit themselves. They could regress. Or they might digress. They might be enticed by new things, distracted from their focus and their purpose, and most importantly, distracted from their loyalty to God. So another thing that Joshua mentions is the danger that they might exchange the faith that got them here, the faith in the God who made these great victories for them. They might exchange that faith for something else that they see all around them, something shiny and new in this new land that they live in. They might exchange their loyalty to God for loyalty to other things, lesser things, the qualities and behaviors of the culture around them. Joshua talks about the gods of the people in whose land you're living being a danger to them. They might regress. They might also digress unless they choose this day who they'll serve. Or they might just settle. They might rest in the things that they have done, great things. But they might rest in what they have done and fail to see that God is not done with them yet and has more work for them to do. At this time when Joshua addresses the people, they have accomplished a lot. But if you read the book of Joshua, if you read the whole thing, you realize that the victories that they have, though impressive, are incomplete. They've answered God's call and they've gone in faith and courage into great portions of this promised land. But there are other parts that they haven't gone into yet. There are other victories that have not yet been won. And Joshua seems concerned that the people might think, well, good enough, right? That they might settle before God has settled them in all of the places of blessing and freedom that God wanted them to reach. So these concerns weigh heavily upon Joshua, even at a milestone like this, even after so much good work has been done, and with so many reasons to rejoice stacked up before them, still Joshua knows how important it is to look forward and to urgently choose every day, to choose this day and every day to serve the Lord with sincerity and with faith. Because the bottom line is, faith in God is not a one-time decision. And faith in God is not just about what you have done in the past tense. Faith in God is a choose this day and every day kind of thing. And sometimes we may need to stop and ask ourselves, who am I going to serve? Regardless of how much or how little we may have done looking back. And when I think about this church, looking back, I see so many great things to rejoice in. But regardless of what we may see looking back, what are we going to choose today? Are we still choosing today to serve the Lord with sincerity and with urgency and in the fullness of faith? Or are we prone to regress, to digress, or just to settle? When was the last time we asked ourselves, who am I going to serve today? And I think it's right to ask it exactly like that. Like, who am I going to serve today? With an emphasis on the I, not because we serve God alone, and actually if we try to do that, we're likely to fail spectacularly. We don't do this alone, but we should have an emphasis on the I in that question, because a community like a congregation, or even like the people of Israel standing in the promised land in Joshua chapter 24, a community of people is only as strong as the personal commitment of the individuals that make up that group. And those smaller units of faith, like a family, are what gives strength to the whole thing. It's the people who say what Joshua said, "As for me and my household will serve the Lord." That's where the strength of the whole thing comes from. Notice how he said, "As for me," that personal commitment and conviction and responsibility. As for me, and as for my household, like that smaller, limited sphere over which I have greater influence. As for my household, we will choose this day to serve the Lord. That's what gives a group of faithful people, a congregation, the nation of Israel, that's what gives them their strength. Individuals and families choosing faith every day. There's a reason that the very first thing that Joshua says to do, you can look this up in Joshua chapter 4 if you like. The very first thing that Joshua says to do when they enter into the promised land, they go through the river of Jordan and into the promised land. And the first thing he tells them to do is gather up stones. Get some rocks, stack them up. And he tells them actually to gather 12 stones. One that represents every single one of the tribes of people that make up this one people. Gather the stones, stack them here on this side of the river. It was a monument to the fact that though one, they were made up of many. And their faith would only be as strong as all those smaller stones that made up the one people that they were. Their strength came from the individuals and the households that made up the tribes that made up their nation. One thing we're going to see as we spend some time in Joshua in April and May, and guess what? We're going to spend some time in Joshua in April and May. One of the things that we're going to see is that even one individual family or even one individual person can have a huge impact on the entire group as they go through this journey together. A lot hinges upon whether or not each person is willing to choose this day who they're going to serve. And it matters incredibly whether or not they're going to regress or digress or settle, or also whether they might accomplish immeasurably more than we can ask or imagine, which in fact they do. Those things hinge upon this question. Who am I going to serve? What will I choose this day? Our congregation depends upon the people who say, "As for me and my house, we'll serve the Lord." I wonder if this is a time for you to do that, to look at your own commitment and answer that question for ourselves. So the entry point into this subject today was this milestone for us as College Hill, 60 years. I don't want to just focus on that this morning, though, because the truth is we all individually in our lives of faith, we also have milestones and turning points and forks in the road of our lives of faith that prompt us to do this kind of reflecting and ask ourselves, who am I really serving? And what am I going to choose? You know, I know people personally who have told me about it was an obstacle in their faith or an illness or an accident that prompted them to really ask themselves, what am I really serving with my life? What am I really choosing? I know folks that for them, getting married or becoming a parent was like that moment in their life where they had to really stop and say, what am I going to choose for me and my household? Who am I going to serve? Sometimes it's the losses in our lives or the sorrows and struggles we go through or our failures that can actually be turning points, mile markers in the road that we can choose who we're going to serve. And when a life is changed at moments like that, it's not because they made a one-time choice. It's because it started off a pattern of choosing every day, as many days as we're able, to serve the Lord. Maybe that's something you can think about today as well. What matters more than what brings us to the question is what we do with it. There are many things in our lives that might cause us to stop and think about who we're going to serve. But what really matters is what we do with the question. As for me and my household, we will serve the Lord. Maybe it's time for you to make a choice like that this morning. When Gerald Ford gave his speech at the bicentennial celebration, one of the main things he said at year 200, he talked a lot about the 3rd century. America had just finished the first of their centuries and the second of their centuries, but his speech mostly focused on the 3rd century. And he told a lot of the story of what had come before, and he talked about those words that were written and signed in that very place where he was standing about life and liberty and the pursuit of happiness, the equality that the nation had sought before. But for Gerald Ford, like Joshua, it was not enough to just look backward. Striving for equality, he said, and perfect justice must characterize our every action. And we shall not be done until all of these things are true of us. In our lives of faith, it's the same way. A sincere faith, a loyal faith to God must characterize our every action. And that means choosing this day who you're going to serve. Maybe it's time for you to renew your commitment to that. I speak to many people today who have passed through the waters like Israel did, the waters of baptism, and made the commitment of who we're going to serve. But sometimes, like Israel, we need to stop and reassess. Are we really serving the Lord as we should? Maybe that's what you need today. Or maybe for somebody else, what you need is to make that choice like you never have before. To be baptized in the name of Christ, washed clean of your sins, and to be given the opportunity to claim where your loyalties lie and to hope in the promise that he gives to us. However you might be called or challenged, let's resolve to respond while we stand and sing.